You're listening to The Secrets of Doctor Who, episode number 96.
Oi! Don't be scared. All of this is new to you, and new can be scary. When people need help, I never refuse. There's this moment when you're sure you're about to die, and then you're born. I know exactly who I am. I'm the Doctor. Ta-da! Ooh. Should be fine.
Hi, I'm Dom Bettinelli, and you're listening to The Secrets of Doctor Who, where we discuss everything about the hit BBC series Doctor Who. Today we're discussing the latest episode called Rosa. Joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Aiken. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Corey Stika. Hi, Father Corey.
How's it going?
Before we get started, folks, I just want to do our usual reminder to please like the Secrets of Doctor Who Facebook page and to like this episode on that page if you can. Retweet our tweets on Twitter on the account at SQPN, to leave comments, write reviews of the podcast. All those things help us to engage with more people. All the social media algorithms and all that sort of stuff relies on your interaction with our stuff on social media and in the various podcast stores, directories, and that sort of thing. So if you can do that, that helps us reach a bigger audience. Remember to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, and on YouTube, where you can hit the bell after you subscribe to make sure you get notifications. And like I said, please share the podcast with your friends. Your especially the new folks who are just coming to Doctor Who with a new doctor, new companions, a new showrunner. There'll be new people out there interested in learning more about Doctor Who and the background and all the sorts of things that we kind of specialize in. So please share the podcast with them. Help us grow our community of listeners and reach more folks. All right, that said, let's get into this episode. Rosa is the third episode of the season. Yeah, third episode. I had to stop for a second there, just double check, make sure my math is right. And so, quick recap. So, while attempting to get back to 2018 Sheffield, the TARDIS takes the Doctor and friends to Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, where they meet Rosa Parks, the civil rights icon. And they also meet another time traveler who's trying to change the future by preventing Rosa's famous act of civil disobedience that launched the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. So that's the episode in a nutshell. Now, obviously, there's the elephant in the room that there's sort of the foundation of this episode, which is the topic of racism. That's really what this is about, and what they're dealing with, and specifically racism at a very particular point in time in U.S. history. And first, I just want to start by saying that Chris Chibnall did take one of our pieces of advice when we gave our advice. We asked him to go to someplace other than Great Britain in the past, present, or future. And certainly Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 is a different from a lot of places that we've seen on Doctor Who in recent years. And I really do like that they did that. And I think just from we'll get into the production and design sort of stuff, but I think that part was I was glad of. One thing that I want to mention, off the top, that we could begin our discussion of this, and we'll talk about the racism issue first, and then we'll get into the other artistic assessments and that sort of stuff second. But they go head on the issue. They don't use an allegory. They don't have an oppressed alien species substituting for a real human minority and allegorically treating with racism, but they go right down to the actual issue historically, with actual historical people in the actual historical circumstances.
I thought that was kind of interesting, because that almost seemed like going back to early Doctor Who, like back the William Hartnell era, where they did the historicals, where they actually did episodes from a historical point. And they did things that were actual historical figures, not just like, we watched the Aztecs, which were just generic Aztecs, so to speak, but actually
they also did the Romans, where we met Nero and so forth.
Right. And so those aspects, I was really actually happy to see that it sort of goes back to the original remit for Doctor Who, which is to present history.
Apropos of that, even though we're still kind of addressing some of the artistic aspects of this,
yep.
This episode, even though it involved a time traveler, which I guess the first one to really do that, where you went into a historical period and encountered a meddling time traveler, was the one with the meddling monk. Mm-hmm. But in those historicals, a frequent theme was, how do we let history play out as it should? Or might there be something interfering?
And that leads actually to that very amazing final scene on the bus. We'll talk about in a little bit.
Right. So the story starts with, for some reason, I'm not sure why they chose to do this, but with 1943.
It's a real historical incident. Rosa Parks in 1943 had an encounter with James Blake that basically was that same encounter. She got on the front entrance of the bus, paid to ride, and was told by him to get on the back entrance. He closed the door on her, and she vowed she would never ride on another bus with him again. Okay. And they didn't bring out that aspect of it. But then in 1955, when she had the famous bus ride where she refused to give up her seat, she hadn't realized he was the driver. Okay. And that's why she was on the bus with him again.
Okay. So one of the things I did try to go look up the actual historical events. They stayed pretty faithful to those historical events. Even the things that were said. In fact, the words at the very end of the episode between
where she
her,
says, "You may do that," when he says he's going to have her arrested.
Right. All of that is historical, which I appreciate. Even the buses were the same. You can actually look up the actual bus from the Montgomery bus system, and they have the bus. I wasn't sure whether the buses actually had signs like they did on it, but there certainly were white section and colored section.
And I think that part is accurate, as well as they had those little placards they could move as needed.
Okay.
Because I remember, I don't think they were the same exact type style, but they were the same basic idea of there are these signs. Because I seem to recall seeing a picture of the inside of one of those buses at one point, and there were those little signs kind of spaced throughout.
So,
fortunately, none of us have seen anything like that in real life in our own lifetimes.
No, thanks be to God.
Yes. All right. So, just to kind of to set the frame narrative of this, Rose, as they kind of mentioned in the episode, but Rose's arrest led to a boycott of the bus system. Martin Luther King was the leader of that boycott, as we saw him in the episode. 99% of African Americans in Montgomery boycotted the buses, which, despite that there was violence and fire bombings of churches and homes in response. And in November 1956, which is a really quick turnaround for something like a U.S. Supreme Court decision, they ruled that segregated busing is illegal. And that's the acknowledged launch of the U.S. civil rights movement. So people sort of look at that as the impetus to get things going. So
one of several things that helped get it going. I mean, they mentioned, for example, the murder of Emmett Till in this episode, which was another such event.
Yes, and in fact, that sort of precipitated this in some ways. Yeah.
Also, we'd already had the integration of the armed forces in 1948. After World War II, it was felt, how can we had all these soldiers who fought bravely for the U.S. who were of African American descent. We can't have this separation going on in the military. So that had already been integrated, and now that was rolling out into civilian society as well.
Yeah. Right. But I guess they see this it's often listed as a symbolic moment.
So many of these big movements, they develop over time, but there's always some point that hits popular imagination.
It's like the shot heard around the world at Concord and Lexington.
Exactly.
The American.
Exactly. There's some point that is this is if it's not the literal start of the movement, it is very much the spiritual start of the movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they do justice to Rosa Parks in this as a figure. I think she comes across as very much a noble person in this. Yeah. So let's get right to the nitty-gritty of it. What did you think of how they dealt with racism in this episode? Jimmy, let's go to you first.
I was very disappointed. Obviously, they made the point that racism is bad. They made that very effectively, and I'll talk more about that when we start discussing the show from an artistic point of view. Artistically, I thought the show had a lot going for it, but one point that I was disappointed at regarding its treatment of the social issue, and I think it's an artistic flaw too, although I'm only going to talk about it here, is I thought that they did the racism aspect of the show in a way that I found disappointing. They showed the brutality of racism, and I thought that was good and that was effective. And they showed it in an unalloyed way. So every single person that we meet in this episode who is a guest actor and is not Black is a racist. Every single one of them, every encounter they have, whether it's the bus driver in 1943 and 1955, whether it's the police officer who barges into the hotel room, whether it's the waitress who kicks him out of the restaurant, whether it's the old man on the street with his wife that Ryan is trying to get to ride the bus, even the guy from the future who's using Captain Jack River song technology that's apparently from the 41st century. Like, why would anyone 2,000 years from now care what skin color you're in? What your skin color is, even, when you're off interacting with completely different species, anything like that's going to fade into the background. You're not going to care about skin color any more than you are eye color.
There might be alienism, but there won't be racism like that.
Right. Not human racism. And even the guy from the future is an out and out racist. So what I had been hoping for was that they would give us a sensitive portrait, not only of the brutality of racism, but also of the human goodness that exists in people of all kinds, including white people in the South who hated racism and did their best to ameliorate it, even though they weren't the socially dominant group at the time. This is something I feel personally about. I'm from the South. There is still racism there. I have met racists. I have had racists say abominable things in my presence that I could not believe someone would say something like this. It was jaw-dropping to me. But in the same way, I also know lots of people in the South who aren't racists, including members of my own family who were alive at that time. There were a lot of white people who they may not have liked the social situation, and they did what they could to help people who were Black. But they were engaged in this issue as well. And what I'd hoped for was a much more nuanced portrait of the situation that wasn't as ham-fisted as the one they gave us. Now, you can say they only have 45 minutes to do this, or 50 minutes, or whatever it is. Fine. But if that's not enough time, then make this a two-parter, because this is a very important issue, and you need to take the time to do it right. And if 50 minutes isn't enough time to do it right, then take more time, do an extra long episode or do a two-parter. But having every single encounter with someone who is a guest actor and is not Black being a vicious racist is unrealistic, and it's an artistic flaw, and I was disappointed by that.
I agree with that largely. I think, given how sensitive of an issue this is right now, especially in our country, that being more nuanced about it would have been better, in the sense of showing, that not everyone was, that it's not simply a division along skin color lines, that there were people who saw that this was an injustice, who just weren't time travelers from the future. Certainly Catholics, just to point out a little historical fact, Catholics were white Catholics, especially, or not just especially, but white Catholics included, were on the front lines of civil rights in the South. Many Catholic priests and bishops marched next to Dr. King and others.
Yeah, there are famous photographs you can go look at today. You can go find them online, where there's Catholic priests standing right on either side of Dr. King as they're marching. I think it was the Selma March.
Yes. And in fact, Catholics were commonly targeted by the same racist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They hated Catholics and blacks and Jews.
Right. And so among the strongest groups in favor of civil rights were also Catholics and Jews, Jewish groups as well.
As a just kind of a point of comparison, someone, I forget who this was, it may have been John Gardner, but someone was commenting about the book The Grapes of Wrath and what kept it from being the great American novel. The Grapes of Wrath, in case you're not aware, is a book. It's set in the Depression era. It's about a family from Oklahoma called the Joad family and the hardships that they're facing as a result of the Dust Bowl and the Depression. And the Joad family in that novel, they're the good guys, and they are a complex good. They, as a family, they're portrayed in a subtle, psychologically sophisticated way. They're not just cookie cutter goody two shoes. They have real psychological depth and complexity. And the comment was, what keeps the Grapes of Wrath from being the great American novel is the fact that it gives us a complex portrait of the good guys against wooden two-dimensional bad guys. That it doesn't show a complex evil. The forces that the Joads are up against are just uniformly bad, kind of cardboard cutouts. And I think that the failure of the Grapes of Wrath on that level artistically is somewhat mirrored in this episode, because we should see more complexity, especially in terms of the guest characters we're meeting.
Okay. Father Corey, your take on this on the racism aspect of this episode,
right? And I'm much more positive, I would say, than Jimmy is on this episode. Now, not knowing a lot of people, frankly, I think I could honestly say I don't know anybody who lived in Alabama or Mississippi at this time. I've known people since, who are younger, who've grown up, in their later, after the 50s. So I don't know what the background is like. I could just go by what I've seen through history books, through pictures and so on. And I agree with his criticism. I agree, Jimmy, I agree 100% with your criticism on how the whites are portrayed in this episode, because we know there were people at the time who were supporting the nascent civil rights movement. We know that. That's a historical fact. We didn't see that at all. That being said, my biggest concern, and I know this is something I addressed with the Chris Chibnall episode, I think it was, or an earlier episode of the podcast, I was afraid that this was going to be an anti-American diatribe for current day. And I will say that is my fault, my misjudgment, my mistake. This wasn't, in my opinion. And I think what redeemed it especially is that quote from Yaz, where Yaz is talking to Ryan behind the dumpster there and says, basically they admitted that racism isn't just an American thing. It exists in Britain as well. And then frankly, I would argue it exists throughout the world. Exactly. It is an unfortunate aspect.
You don't have to argue that. You don't have to argue that.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear. That's an unfortunate aspect of our human nature. But things are better. The United States and Britain today are not the United States and Britain in 1955 and before.
We still
things have gotten better.
There's still things that need to be fixed, but it's not as bad as it once was.
Exactly.
And they said that.
I love the exact quote from her. She talks about how we have elected a black president, and who knows where they'll be in 50 years later. That's proper change. So I admit this is my fault. This was my maybe being oversensitive to some of the trends within TV today. And so, I applaud them. I think, again, not knowing all the dynamics of what life was like in Birmingham, Alabama in 1955, but I applaud them for this episode because I think they basically I misjudged them. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah. For my part, apart from the sort of flat characterization of white people in this episode, that if you're not a time traveler from the future, you must have been a racist. If you were
even if you are a time traveler from the future, you may be a racist.
Right, that's right. Kreska was. If you're not an actual 21st century
TARDIS member,
you're right. Apart from that, I felt like they had it's a pretty straightforward examination of the ills of, as you said, Jimmy, of the ills of racism, of how so it was sort of remember this was pretty bad. Like let's not forget how bad this was. This was kind of what they were saying. And I appreciate them handling it the way they did. They handled it with sensitivity, and without they didn't need to over dramatize to kind of to make over. I guess that's enough to say, over dramatize it. I do appreciate that this was back to the first Doctor historicals. I like that idea that they decided to do. I just think if this were done for the 10th Doctor or 11th Doctor, the crazy bombastic stuff that they would have written for the Doctor to be doing in this episode. This was handled fairly calmly and straightforwardly, and I appreciate that. One question comes up, and maybe our British listeners can tell us: how much do you actually learn about Rosa Parks in school? It kind of surprised me that they portrayed Yaz and Ryan of having learned about Rosa Parks to the point where Yaz was saying like the schools were like their school had the different levels got names, and one of them was named for Rosa Parks. Yeah. So it's kind of I'm kind of curious. Yeah.
Well, not just that, but both Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King, to the point where when Ryan meets him, he's starstruck. He's absolutely, this. Right. This is like a dream come true to meet him.
MLK, I can buy because he's a much bigger figure, but it's Rosa Parks was a little surprising.
And I guess we're sort of transitioning now into the more artistic aspects of the episode, so we may want to back up and talk about it from the beginning. But just in terms of Martin Luther King showing up, I really liked the fact that he showed up, and I liked the way they handled him, because historically, I mean, he's more famous than Rosa Parks. More people know the name Martin Luther King than they do Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
They're both extremely important figures historically, but he's the one that's the more famous, and he didn't get top billing here. Right. He just shows up. He's like a bonus to get to meet him. Well, and they didn't make him the focus of the episode. And what I really like is the fact Ryan was the one who got to meet him, not the Doctor, and not the whole TARDIS crew.
Yep. Right.
The Doctor didn't even get to meet him. It's just Ryan who did. And I like that thing of a companion having a historical encounter with someone, famous from history that the Doctor isn't even a part of.
Right. And as far as I recall, outside of Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King wasn't even known at all.
No,
really,
until
not even after. Not even outside of Montgomery. It's the boycott that really catapults him.
So they played that well, where he was just kind of he's a preacher in this humble little church.
Which was what made it so funny, was this British guy saying, my grandmother loves you. And they're like, well, how does your grandmother even know him? That's
exactly.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump to the beginning, back to the rest of the episode, and sort of talk about the artistic and storytelling merits of it. Like I said at the beginning, the Doctor says in the beginning she was aiming for Sheffield in 2018, but I think what did she say, 9 or 19 attempts went wrong.
She said 9. Graham said 14.
Oh, right, that's what it was. Yeah. And
but even before that, though, we have the 1943 opening.
Okay.
And just on an artistic level, watching that, it's like, wow, this is a really dark opening for Doctor Who.
Okay. Yeah.
It feels very somber, and it feels very emotionally real. Even though the stakes are not as high as what we often have on this show. I mean, no one's shooting at anybody. There are not laser blasts going off. There's not an alien race invading. From that perspective, it's much more subdued, but it also feels much darker and much more real because it's a real world situation. It's not involving fantasy violence and fantasy scenarios. Right. This is something that really happened, and it's very sombering to watch that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, we've criticized, especially Stephen Moffat's era of Doctor Who,
as
where
too
every
fantasy.
time the Doctor came up with some kind of issue, it was the entire universe is going to explode unless I cut this one wire.
Well,
yeah.
To be honest, though, they did kind of do that here because Cresco, we'll talk about the villain in this one, or one of the villains, we could say, in this one. He was trying to change the future by manipulating this event, and because at the end, the Doctor says, Rosa Parks changed the universe as they look out into the vast, and there's an asteroid with her name that's been named after her. And I'm like, we're like, isn't it enough of what she actually did? Like, do we have to pump it up to something more?
There is a little bit of that. They didn't. Having an asteroid named after you is not you changing the universe. That's someone else changing a name. But what they could have said is she helped humanity get over its race issues, and that has continuing ripples out into the future. Yeah. That's her real legacy. The asteroid may be a symbol of her legacy, but her real legacy is interracial healing.
Right. They just wanted the asteroid special effects again in the episode.
But by making this about Cresco wanting to change the future, I feel like they tried to ramp up the implications for this, and they were kind of falling back into the old ways. Like we talked about, the last couple episodes have been small stakes back to that idea, and this one they kind of wanted to go for the big stakes, to really ramp it up, and which wasn't necessary, I don't think.
We've also commented on and this was another piece of our advice for Chris Chibnall, was go more realistic than the fairy tale stuff that Moffat was doing. And the fairy tale stuff could be fun, but I just got tired of it. As an example, though, I mean, contrast this with the episode from the previous season where the Doctor took Bill to the ice fair.
Right.
Yeah. And Bill immediately brings up, the issue of race and asks about that. And the Doctor has this fantasy explanation of, Jesus was black and the past was a lot more black than you thought, and don't worry about it and stuff like that. And even back in the Russell T. Davies era, when the 10th Doctor took Martha Jones back to the 16th century, she raises the "Am I in danger because I'm black?" issue, and he says, "Nah, just walk around like you own the place." And both of those, I guess, are okay ways of getting the plot moving, so that we can have an adventure here and not have to deal with some of the darker aspects of these things. But wow, this episode is way more, really goes there. I mean, this is a much more serious treatment than the kind of fantasy treatment we had before.
I like that.
We've criticized in the past where they've taken what they perceive as modern views, modern ideas, and put them in the mouths of people in the past.
Right.
So we definitely can't criticize them for that in this episode.
They definitely did not do that here. That's for sure. So there was that opening scene. Then we have the Doctor and her friends arriving.
Oh, by the way, I just on the people being creatures of their time thing, I like how they applied that even to Rosa Parks, because when Ryan talks to her and initially just says yes, and it's like, "I will accept a yes, ma'am."
Right. I don't know how your mama raised you, but I will accept a yes, ma'am.
Exactly. I mean, growing up in the South, politeness was really stressed to us growing up. I mean, I still call people sir and ma'am all the time, which sometimes causes a little bit of perplexity on the part of people who were raised elsewhere when I'm sirring and mamming them. But this is the way we were raised, and it's politeness, and you be polite. And I loved how Rosa Parks, even though she was forward looking in terms of race, she also insisted on politeness, and in that she was very much a woman of her time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I've even had that trained into me just with the Air Force. You know, you're talking to somebody superior to you. It's sir, yes, sir. You know,
exactly. And I did like that about her, Rosa's dignity in that.
Mm-hmm.
Like she had a really sense of dignity. Okay, can I talk about the Doctor arriving?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the TARDIS takes them to this time, and this is something we see quite often, is that the TARDIS takes the Doctor where she needs to go as opposed to where she was wanting to go, because the TARDIS has a bit of its own mind and will and knows that there's a problem here related to a time traveler in 1955 Montgomery. So that's an interesting continuation of that idea. And then we also get a revelation that the Doctor once gave Elvis a mobile phone.
It had to be a super phone because there were no mobile networks to connect to in 1955.
Well, it's just like
Rosa's phone.
Rosa's,
that's what I said. It's a super phone.
Super phone, right? Which then, of course, it comes up again later in the episode when she uses her ability to call Elvis to set up this fake game show win trip for this bus driver to go see Frank Sinatra in Vegas with his wife.
So she calls Elvis and gets Frank.
Exactly. And so the reason they came is because they detected traces of Artron energy in Montgomery. Now, Jimmy, as our resident expert in all things Doctor Who, could you explain again to us Artron energy? Why she would have detected it?
Artron energy is a fictional form of energy in the Doctor Who universe that is connected with time travel and Time Lord technology and is part of how the Doctor regenerates. When you see all that energy being released by the Doctor whenever there's a regeneration, that's Artron energy. What I found interesting here is she referred to Artron molecules, which would imply that not only is Artron energy, but you can also knit it together as Artron matter. And I think that's the first time I've encountered that idea.
Right, because energy and matter are two different states, if you remember from your physics in school.
Unless you're a Time Lord, then they can be both at the same time.
Then they're wibbly wobbly, mattery energy.
Quantum mechanics is pretty wibbly wobbly to begin with.
Well, this is true. So we have. We see a speaking of which, we end up seeing a vortex manipulator and a time displacement gun.
Which is that was interesting. I like that. It's kind of it's essentially the same thing as what Weeping Angels do to you. But now you've got the Weeping Angel effect without the statue part.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to this time traveling gun because we see it a couple of times. But I was going to say so we have this time traveling greaser, this Fonzie of the future. We'll call him the future Fonz. We end up finding out his name is actually Cresco, not the cooking thing, but it's apparently spelled some other way, which I've seen like 3 different ways online. Who is we found out he's a former inmate in Storm Cage Prison, which we have seen before, right?
Right.
Oh,
that's where River Song was imprisoned.
I was supposedly imprisoned, although she kept coming and going as she pleased.
Pretty much pleased.
Yeah.
I had a slight feeling or hint, which I really felt like that. No, it can't possibly be. But since River is technically part Time Lord or whatever, Gallifreyan, I was a little wondering, was this River?
Okay,
but of course it isn't.
It's not. Yeah. They'd established she burned through all of her regenerations. In becoming River Song and saving the Doctor's life. Also, Chris Chibnall has said no River Song. The season is about newness, even though he lets the Doctor historical name drop. And also River Song is not a horrendous monster racist who's killed thousands of people and wants to derail history.
Well, once that came up, I knew it wasn't River Song. However, you've mentioned before that this guy kind of reminds you of the monk or the time meddler. Is it possible?
He was a comic figure. He wasn't a and he was a Time Lord. A couple of points of difference. So if he was this guy wouldn't be the meddling monk because the meddling monk was a Time Lord. This guy is portrayed as a human.
Yeah.
He's as shown by the storm cage and the vortex manipulator wristband and things like that. He doesn't have any Time Lord technology, which the monk was. The monk had his own TARDIS and so forth.
Okay, good. Okay, so that settles that question then. So I like her. Yeah, go ahead.
I do wonder if he might be a recurring figure.
He may,
or if they're going to build him and just throw him away like this, for
Tim
this one
Shaw.
episode.
Like Tim Shaw, right? Maybe he's no, never mind. I won't go there. He's a disguised whatchamacallit, whatever Tim Shaw's race was. I forget again. I do like Sensa. I do like the Doctor's banter with Cresco. It's not bluster. It's not like how dare you take me on. But she is quite firm with him in that. So there's a nice balance there.
I thought she was getting a little petulant with him. I mean, she's kind of getting a little bit high and mighty abusive towards him in a kind of Peter Capaldi way.
You mean when
she's like I can even take once she realizes, I forget what they call it, but the brain implant that serves as an order of inhibition.
Yeah, the neurological inhibitor. Yeah. Yeah,
and then she starts I can even take your vortex manipulator and stamp on it, and you can't do anything to stop me. And this kind of scene where the Doctor's just getting high and mighty is not my favorite kind of scene.
Okay. I
don't see it anywhere near to the level of Peter Capaldi, but I didn't quite see that. Actually, I again, this is one of these where you definitely see the difference in this Doctor versus, again, especially the 10th and the 11th. At no point does she introduce herself to anybody.
Right.
At no point do you hear "I'm the Doctor" or anything like that. And you definitely don't get "I'm the oncoming storm, Daleks fear me and there's nightmares," nothing like that.
The oncoming storm. I'm going to use that someday. I'm going to tell someone I'm the oncoming storm.
By the way, I did, since you commented on banter, I did like I really, really like some of the individual bits of dialogue in this episode. And in fact, Ryan got two of my favorite lines where they're talking about Rosa Parks, and I think it's Yaz says to Ryan, you do know who she was, right? And he says, yeah, first black woman to drive a bus. Oh, that's so human, to kind of know, but kind of get it wrong.
Like, didn't quite do really that well in school. Like, didn't quite remember his history lessons.
But then he gets a totally on top of it line when they're in the restaurant. Yeah. And the racist waitress comes up and says, we don't serve Negroes here. And he says, good, because I don't eat them.
Yes, that was pretty good.
Back at you there.
Yeah. There were actually, one of the things I really liked was they were in the motel room and the Doctor starts drawing on the wall. And when Graham says to her, "You ain't Banksy," and she says, "Or am I?"
Yeah, or am I?
And then plays that several times in this episode, like about whether she or not the Doctor is actually Banksy. And I love that Banksy, for those who don't know, is a British street artist who is anonymous and is famous for not just for the street art, but for the prankster way that he does it in sort of the iconoclastic anti-establishment thing, which the latest bit, I don't know if you guys had seen this in the, I'm sure you have.
That was pretty wild.
There was a self-shredding picture.
Yeah, there was an auction at Sotheby's of one of his pictures or paintings that someone had purchased, and in a frame that Banksy himself had built around it. It's so fabulous. As soon as it was sold for £1.5 million or something like that, he must have been present because he pressed the button. Actually, he was present because or she was present because they posted a video of him doing this. Not the face, of course, just the hand. He pressed a remote control and it started to shred the picture coming out of the frame. It stopped halfway, not by design, by the way.
It jammed up.
It jammed up. He said, it like the video says, it worked in rehearsal. But he built it like 2 years ago. I mean, this picture. So this is Banksy, and it's sort of like, I could see the Doctor could be a Banksy in that sense.
And just for also the art house was speculating afterwards that by shredding or half shredding the picture, its value may actually have increased as a result.
Oh, I'm sure it has.
The art world is in agreement that it's worth a lot more now. The buyer,
especially since there is the video of it. That, will accompany this picture to the end of time.
The buyer did agree to purchase the painting after all. The other bit I liked was when they're confronted, like Graham and the doctor are confronted by this policeman in the motel room. And what are you doing in Montgomery? Oh, we're selling a new phone. That's a camera and all these things. And what's your name? I'm Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
I love that. That was a nice moment. I like that bit there.
By the way, speaking of Graham, we also got a nice moment where Grace comes up and he doesn't tear up, but he pauses in a way. He says he wishes she was here, and he pauses in a way that indicates he does have some grief he's dealing with. And I've kind of been looking for that, and I'm glad they included that.
Yeah. We mentioned last time in our discussion of Ghost Monument that it didn't seem like he was, dealing with his grief so far. But it is nice for them to include that moment. I did like that when he mentions that Nan had a T-shirt that said "Spirit of Rosa" on it. Which makes the fact that Ryan didn't know what Rosa Parks actually did even more egregious on his part.
I like that Ryan gets another nice line right after Graham says he wishes Grace were here, because Ryan says, "I don't. She'd start a riot."
Yes. Yes. There was a moment later on where this is kind of just one of my pet peeves. The doctor and friends are on the bus scheming. They've been they know that Kresko is going to try to interrupt the famous moment. He's going to try to disrupt it, and so they're trying to plan ahead.
And incidentally, they don't quite. I don't think they quite fully spell it out. But because he's got the neural implant that prevents him from killing anybody, that's why he's doing this workaround, let's change history thing, because he can't just kill Rosa Parks.
Right.
He's to derail the future. He's got to do something much more complex.
Which is actually a clever way to handle it. It really is a clever way to kind of handle that story-wise of saying, okay, so
so why doesn't he just kill her? Right.
Murder's off, seriously injuring her is off. How do we do this? Well, let's tweak the situation just a little bit.
Right. And that actually was, because otherwise it would be like a very short episode. He tries to kill Rosa and they stop him. I mean, it would be very straightforward, and it wouldn't be as fun.
They could fill it with a lot of running through corridors if they need to pad it out the running time.
Yes,
exactly.
They, as we have seen in the past, they've done sometimes. But I did like, though. So they're following her. They're trying to figure out her schedule. What do we got to do? And they're all they're sitting on the bus, kind of scheming. And meanwhile, there are these two guys sitting right behind them, listening to everything. You can see one of the two extras kind of paying attention to the doctor talking into Graham talking. Exactly. I'm like, what are these guys thinking about these crazy Brits on the bus with them? I just thought that was had to be very funny. And then we have a moment where, like you mentioned, the Ryan meets Martin Luther King. The other fellow, I think Abernathy, I think was his name, who was also a historical figure, and Rose's husband,
who was also a historical figure.
So my wife had a question about Rose's husband's appearance, the actor. He looked Caucasian, he looked white, but was that just he was relatively light-skinned?
I think Rosa and her husband were just light-skinned. This is, in fact, a common complaint of African-American actors in Hollywood, that Hollywood is not interested in casting you if you're a light black or a yellow black, as the terms are sometimes used. They only want dark-skinned blacks. And there are different skin tones in the African-American community, and Hollywood is not as interested in all of them. And I thought that that showing that range here was actually a nice thing, because that does reflect real life. And I felt, good for these actors that they're able to play this role and represent these parts of the community.
Yeah.
Right. And I the first time I watched the episode, when I watched it yesterday, I had kind of the same reaction, because I think that when you first see her husband, the lighting is such a way that he does look extremely light skinned, to the point of not any kind of African-American skin tone at all. But then you see him in the next scene, and it's darker lighting, and I think it shows his skin tone better.
Plus, he has white hair, which kind of accentuates that.
Exactly.
Fact.
Exactly. He almost looked like, actually, the first scene, he almost looks like Ted Danson in The Good Place.
That's right. That's right.
That's why I kind of thought that first reaction.
So at one point, the doctor has a line that kind of stuck out to me. She says, all right, what we're doing now is, our mission here is we have to keep history in order, not changing it, guarding it. And it really, I mean, is that not sort of a summation of how the doctor deals with history, right?
Well, no, the doctor changes it sometimes. She has the two modes of we've got to change this and then we've got to preserve this. But the thing that struck me, and I thought this was weak, I mean, you can excuse it because it's a children's show, but if you can do that, you can excuse anything because it's a children's show.
Okay.
Come on, guys. We're 33 minutes into the broadcast. We're 2/3 the way through. I saw that this is going to be a let's keep history on course thing before the episode even aired.
Okay.
And this is weak writing if you're just figuring this out now.
So stating the obvious. Okay. Yeah. There was another moment where it was a little bit obvious, the writing, where Ryan is playing with the time displacement device, and the doctor explains how it works. Yeah. So that later
exactly how it works, but then says, very simple, very deadly.
Yes. Well, but also, like, Chekhov's time displacement device, as soon as you see the explanation of how it's going to be used, then he tosses it on the bed.
Yeah.
Well, later on, we know that Ryan is going to have to use this device.
And this is one of my complaints about the writing, because the doctor does not get after him for that. The doctor does not say anything to him about the fact that he zapped Cresco back thousands of years, because she's willing to criticize over guns. It's just, it doesn't, I'm
is it
surprised
violent?
because she said,
I mean, it's just a time displacement, right? I mean, is he hurting
yeah,
us?
but he said he cranked it back as far as he could. So if it could go forward 79,000 years or whatever, or to 79th century, from the 20th century, we'll track back 59 centuries and see where we're at.
Yeah.
That's not exactly a nice place to end up.
Yeah, and hypothetically, he could end up in any kind of an unsurvivable environment. I mean, if it went back far enough, he could go to a pre-oxygen Earth. And even if not, he could end up in the middle of an ice age with no clothing protection and no ability to kill food.
Yeah.
Or with the dinosaur.
Or defend himself. Yeah.
Look, a T-Rex. Yeah.
So,
okay.
I mean, that was just surprised me that they didn't even just have where she grabs it out of his hand and
Well, she wasn't present when he did it, but yeah.
But I mean, after the fact.
Yeah. Hopefully, they destroyed it and didn't leave it laying around in Montgomery in 1955. That would be a bad thing. So we get to the end, that iconic scene, that moment that we've been waiting for, where Rosa has to get up from the bus. And the whole time they've been trying to make sure that the bus is full enough so that when the time comes, the bus driver, Blake, has to tell her to get up, and she refuses. And in fact, what happens, the way that they write the scene, is Graham and the doctor have to stay and be the last two white people, in that place. If they had gotten off the bus before, Rosa wouldn't have had to get up. And so they have to stay there and be sort of part of the cause of her arrest.
Right.
In some ways, it's portrayed as you've done this horrible thing to her. But in some ways, they actually, I mean, she's arrested, but she doesn't have any long-lasting ill effect because of the arrest. She's not mistreated or beaten up.
They do say she has a hard life after this, but she's also becomes the pivotal figure.
Right.
Who accomplishes all this good. I thought this was this is a psychologically morally complex moment.
Yeah.
And I thought that was good. I also thought a lot of other moments in this were good too, because even though they were very clear that, they're dealing with a bad situation with this, evil racism in this culture, they had to work with it. And they didn't do a lot of what would have happened in previous eras of the show. You would have had a lot of, rather than saying, okay, we're in this bad situation, but we need to work with it. There would have been a lot of virtue signaling and, futuristic declarations in the face of the racists. And the fact that Ryan did get on the back of the bus is that's a human, realistic, tragic, morally objectionable, and all kinds of, there's just a lot of complexity there. That's good writing, because if you were a time traveler and you encounter whatever it is you look like, or whatever your gender is, or whatever other characteristic you have that people may not like at some point, you're going to have to do things like that if you're going to travel the universe. The Doctor is going to have to do things like that. The Doctor has encountered things like that in the past, where you're dealing with people who have an irrational prejudice against you, and you've got to just deal with that fact because there's nothing you can do about it at the moment. That gets us into the realm of art rather than just polemicizing. When you work with that situation, have to deal with it, that's where art starts to happen. And so I really like that. I also like the complexity with Yaz's situation, where they assume she's Mexican because they have no experience of Pakistanis. And then it turns out we've got the ambiguity where she gets on the front of the bus and doesn't know where she's allowed to sit at first, and thinks, does color just mean black in 1955? And it turns out it looks like it does, because she gets to sit in sometimes because she gets to sit in the white section. Right. And having the team split like that, where Ryan has to be in the back, Yaz is allowed in the front, and the Doctor and Graham are in the front, and it's like, wow, is that uncomfortable and complex? And this is sophisticated in a way that they didn't have to be, and I want to give them credit for that.
Yeah, and on that bus, on that particular time, with that particular bus driver, Yaz was allowed to come through the front door and sit in the front. Maybe on Blake's bus, she might have been made to sit in the back. Certainly at the restaurant, they didn't like her because she was quote unquote Mexican and kicked her out. And it shows the complexity of what it was like to be a person who didn't quite fit in to the categories. And certainly you weren't white, and therefore, well, what am I, and how do I fit into the world? And I think it very well, from my point of view as someone who's not a racial minority, to kind of give me an introduction to what it was like for people like that then. Certainly it can't be complete, of course, but in a 45-minute TV show. But I think it was an effective presentation within the constraints that they had to give.
Something occurred to me regarding the vocabulary they used on the show for Ryan and Yaz. In describing their races, or in Yaz's case, their presumed background, the terms they use are deliberate for the period, are deliberately neutral.
Yes.
The term colored at the time was neutral. That's why it's not meant to be offensive. That's why Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King are early members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So that was even the preferred term in some circles at the time. Right. When the waitress uses Negro, that's not meant to be offensive as a term. That was a neutral term. There are offensive terms she could have used and didn't.
Absolutely.
And the same thing is true for Yaz. When the waitress refers to her as a Mexican, that's a neutral term as well. There are much worse terms for Mexicans that could have been used in that scene. So I thought that was interesting that the show went with period neutral terms, even if some of them, like Negro, have acquired different nuances in subsequent years. Right.
They didn't impose a modern sensibility on those terms, Negro or colored, that for the time period. Yeah, I don't think there's any way they could have used the words that probably would have been used.
Not on
by
a
at least
show.
Not on, no. Yeah, no way. I did like that the fact that we had not just Ryan's experience as a black man, but we had Yaz's experience as a sort of in between, like sort of caught in the middle. sort of what, where does she fit in this? And it kind of exposes a little the stupidity of racism, just because, she's darker than, or he's darker than her, and she's darker than the doctor. And it's the kind of the craziness of it. So I did like that. And having them both was good.
I think it kind of emphasized too, racism is, it's as much about seeing the other person as different than me, therefore they must be less.
Right.
Right. So.
Yeah. And in this case, like having someone of from British terms, you say Asian. That's what how they would refer to someone from, say, like India, Pakistan, or any place from the continent of Asia. Asian, someone whose origin, the ancestors are from Africa. Having someone who's European as the companions, it really served the story very well. Having this group with the doctor, I don't think, like, if it had been one companion, if it had been Clara or even Rory and Amy, or even Martha
Bill.
Jones or Bill, I don't think this story would have worked quite the way it did. I'm glad we had this group with this doctor.
Right.
And the fact that we have multiple characters with multiple different backgrounds adds to the complexity and thus the artistic depth of the episode.
I love the fact a couple times when Graham pointed out that Ryan was his grandson, and the reactions that got a couple times was great. One last thing to point out: the song that played over the end and the end credits is a song called "Rise Up" by a performer. Her name is Andra Day. I quite like the song, actually. I thought it was a nice song, and I'll put a link in the show notes to the YouTube of it, and there's lyrics there even you can read, and I quite like that
nice
song.
By the way, another song note: early on, when we're in 1955, just as the TARDIS is about to land, we have this moment where we're following like a classic 1950s car down the street, and we have this doo-wop music playing.
Yep.
And it has this Back to the Future 1955 nostalgia vibe.
Right.
Which is, in the way it plays out in the episode, it's kind of a fake out. Emotionally, it's evoking this nostalgia, and then they're about to hit you with some hard reality. But I thought that was an interesting moment. Speaking of getting hit with hard reality, the moment when the racist hits Ryan for trying to give the glove back to his wife, I found that a little implausible because in reality, people would pick up a woman's glove and try to give it back to her. They might not have done it exactly the way Ryan did, but I'm willing to, and I think they tried to set that up to show why the guy would have that reaction, but it didn't quite come across to me as fully this is what would have happened. But I can accept this one because they need to demonstrate the reality and the brutality of racism.
Yeah.
And this is their way of doing that for our main cast. Our main cast needs a short, sharp shock, to quote Gilbert and Sullivan, to alert them to the kind of situation they're in. And this is their way of doing that, even though I thought they could have set it up a little better.
Yep. Yeah, because he grabbed her, and the guy reacted with anger. And then Rosa says tensions are high because of the Emmett Till case that just happened.
Right.
So yeah. But you're right. It does come across as a little abrupt, but I see what you're saying. Can I move on to some feedback, or is there any more notes on this episode?
One thing I want to point out is they made a mistake when they talk about Rosa Parks receiving the medal from President Clinton.
Yes.
She did not receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. That is only for military people. That is the highest honor for someone in the military. What she received is the Presidential Medal of Freedom from him. Yes. So it's a minor. It's not a minor thing, actually. I mean, because these are the two highest awards that someone can receive in the United States.
Yes,
but I thought it was important in pointing that out.
Yeah, that is an important distinction. Yeah.
Only other thing I wanted to point out is they avoided, and this is to their credit, they avoided a trap they could have fallen into with this episode. If you're going to somebody who's made a big historical achievement like Rosa Parks or Shakespeare or whoever, you with a show like this, you run the risk of accidentally cheapening their achievement. Because if it turns out, like if you go back and, the Doctor gave Shakespeare all of the ideas for the plays he ever wrote.
Yeah. We haven't seen that, have we?
Yeah. Well, then you're cheapening Shakespeare's actual accomplishment.
Right.
And it would have been a flaw in the writing. I would have been offended if they had done it to where, like, the TARDIS crew goes back and they are the ones who cause Rosa Parks to have the idea of doing this.
Exactly.
And that's going to cheapen Rosa Parks's real achievement. And they didn't do that. And so the only alternative to that, if you're going to have interaction of a dramatic nature with a historical character, is rather than giving the person the idea or whatever, is you're just trying to keep history on course. Something else is from out of time is trying to interfere with that.
Right.
And so they went with the logical way that would allow them to interact with Rosa Parks without inadvertently cheapening what she did, because all they're doing is neutralizing an outside threat and letting her go ahead and do what she did on her own.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I agree with that. Any other notes? Okay, so just a little bit of feedback here from folks. We get quite a bit of feedback from some episodes going back, but let me just see if I can go through some of it here. On our last episode, Ghost Monument, Rick Angelini writes in. He says he did not like that episode and didn't even watch the last 20 minutes. He said one of his criticisms was there was way too much use of the sonic screwdriver and that it became a crutch. Interesting. I mean, you might say that about
that's been a criticism for a while. I mean,
the producers of the show have gone back and forth on this. There was a time back in the Tom Baker era and again in the Peter Davison era where the producers thought it was becoming a crutch and they wanted the Doctor to have to solve problems without the sonic screwdriver. And in Peter Davison's era, they even destroyed it, and he didn't have it for a long time. The kind of contrary view is, and this really characterizes the modern show, is that if you've only got 45 minutes to tell a story, you need the plot to move along briskly, and this is a way of enabling that to happen. And given that we have multifunction devices right now, in the form of our phones and even our watches, are beginning to do this, where you can detect multiple different. I mean, there are even apps you can put on your phone to make it a radiation detector.
Mm-hmm.
And so, given that we have multifunction devices right now, I don't think it's unreasonable, personally, to accept the sonic screwdriver as a kind of Time Lord iPhone that moves the plot along.
Okay.
But that's just me.
Okay. Our next bit of feedback is from our friend Amy Flowers on Facebook, commenting on our discussion of the Tomb of the Cybermen. And she says, one scene that really stood out to me that I wanted to mention was the conversation about grief between Victoria and the Doctor. It was sweet and gentle and showcased the Doctor's compassion to help with the fresh pain Victoria was going through. I've only watched a little of the second Doctor, but I'm getting the feeling he's going to be a favorite. And as I recall, that was very well done.
So Victoria, for people who may not remember that, and I don't know if we even talked about it when we reviewed the episode, Victoria's father was a 19th century British guy, kind of scientist, who got involved in the Daleks and got over his head. He was like working on time travel research, and he had a tragic ending, which then led to Victoria traveling with the Doctor. And so she's missing her family in that scene, and asks him about his family. And he says, well, they live in my mind, and I can think about them and remember them and stuff like that. It's a really nice scene. And I totally agree. Patrick Troughton is my favorite Doctor.
Then on our Peter Capaldi retrospective, episode 90, Rob Cox says he watched the last two episodes of the final season of Peter Capaldi's final season, not including the Christmas special. And he said, I found I really enjoyed him as a Doctor after they got away from his first season crankiness. One thing I noticed about his character development the episode Last Christmas, which was the previous Christmas episode, I think it was.
No, Last Christmas was the title of one of it was the one with Nick Frost as Santa Claus.
So that was like 2 Christmas episodes ago.
Twice Upon a Time was the more recent one.
So 2015, because the Return of Dr. Mysterio was 2016. Right. So 2015. Sorry. So in the episode, it showed his change from cranky old man to more doctor-like. When he took the reins of Santa's sleigh, you saw a marked change in his attitude. And then Rob was saying, I just hope they don't mess up with the new doctor, which I don't think they have. I think they've kept her enjoyable. In Smith and Jones, episode number 89, our friend Bennett Gillespie, who's become our expert in all things British culture and British society.
He has a native advantage.
He does. He says, enjoying the episode, but the Mr. and Doctor thing, we were talking about the surgeon. They called him Mr., not Doctor, and we were talking about why that is.
Yeah.
He says it goes back to the Middle Ages, where a surgeon was just a tradesman, like a carpenter, but a doctor was much more educated. So Mr. indicates he's both a consultant, but his specialty is surgical of some kind.
Interesting.
And I think we have some others, other feedbacks, a little longer, so I don't want to take up too much of our time with this. We'll maybe come back to it in a future episode. And,
absolutely.
We really do appreciate all your feedback, even if we don't get a chance to read it on air or to play it. We do appreciate you sending it to us. So that's it from us. Tell us what you think of this episode of Rosa. I didn't even get to mention the fact that the Rosa is a very similar name to Rose, which was the first episode of the reboot of Doctor Who. So
we mentioned that last time.
Okay, all right. So I'm just remembering something that one of you said, so that's good. So what did you think of Rosa? And let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Secrets of Doctor Who Facebook page. Find the show post there and leave us some feedback, or send us an email to drwho@sqpn.com. You can find links to all of our personal social media and websites on our show notes on sqpn.com, as well as relevant links for this episode. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing arachnids in the UK. Oh boy, spiders, my favorite. Why did it have to be spiders? Until then, Father Corey Stika, thank you for joining me in sharing the Secrets of Doctor Who.
Glad to be here, and thanks, Dom.
And Jimmy Aiken, thank you as well.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Doctor Who on StarQuest. And remember, you may do that.
Right. This is going to be fun.